In the summer of 1944, 40 convicted criminals, military misfits, and punishment detail Marines landed on a blood-soaked Pacific island with a mission so dangerous that command expected none of them to survive. They were thieves, brawlers, and troublemakers pulled from the brigs and stockades of the Marine Corps, given experimental weapons, and trained in killing techniques so brutal they were forbidden from discussing them. Their target was an island fortress defended by 30,000 fanatical Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die before surrendering. Within 72 hours, these 40 outcasts would penetrate enemy lines so deeply they would call artillery strikes on their own positions, discover a hidden armored division preparing to annihilate the American beachhead, and fight their way back through enemy territory in a desperate night withdrawal that would become legend. More than half would never make it home. This is the story of the 40 Thieves, the Marine Scout sniper platoon that changed special operations warfare forever, and the hell they endured on Saipan. The seeds of this extraordinary unit were planted in the blood-stained coral of Tarawa Atoll, where in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered catastrophic losses assaulting a tiny island that intelligence had promised would fall in hours. Over 1,000 Marines died in 76 hours because reconnaissance had failed. The Marines had landed blind, unaware of reef depths, Japanese bunker positions, or the true strength of the enemy garrison. Ships had bombarded empty beaches while fortified positions remained untouched. Colonel Merritt Edson, known as Red Mike, decided such wholesale slaughter would never happen again on his watch. Edson and Lieutenant Colonel James Roosevelt, son of the president, approached Colonel Chester Risley with a radical proposal. They would create an experimental scout sniper platoon that would operate independently ahead of assault forces, penetrating enemy territory to gather intelligence, mark targets, and eliminate key threats. But this would not be a unit of parade ground Marines with spotless service records. Risley wanted men who could think independently, survive in impossible conditions, and kill without hesitation. He wanted men who had already proven they would break rules to accomplish objectives. He wanted criminals. The call went out across Marine installations in the Pacific. Military prisoners with combat experience, men serving punishment details for insubordination, brawling, theft, or unauthorized absence. Within weeks, 40 of the most promising troublemakers assembled at Camp Tarawa on the Big Island of Hawaii. They arrived in chains under guard with service records that read like rap sheets. Most expected another punishment detail. Instead, they found Lieutenant Frank Tachsky waiting for them. Tachsky told them simply that they had been chosen for a mission that would likely kill them all. They would be trained to operate behind enemy lines, outnumbered and unsupported, gathering intelligence that would save thousands of Marine lives. They would learn to kill silently, move through jungle without leaving traces, call artillery fire on targets they could see and touch. They would become ghosts, invisible to the enemy until the moment they struck. Every man was given one chance to walk away. Not one did. The training transformed these 40 misfits into something unprecedented in Marine Corps history. A former Shanghai policeman taught them silent killing, demonstrating where to place the knife for instant death, how to strangle without allowing the victim to make sound. They practiced on dummies, then on live pigs that screamed and thrashed as they learned to kill efficiently. A Hawaiian native scout taught them to step on roots and rocks rather than soft earth, to freeze when birds went silent, to feel the wind before moving through vegetation. They learned to lie motionless for hours in observation posts, controlling their breathing, ignoring thirst and insects and cramping muscles. They received Springfield 1903 rifles fitted with 8-power unertl scopes, weapons capable of killing at ranges exceeding 800 yards. They trained with M1 carbines, Thompson submachine guns, and bazookas. They learned to coordinate with artillery forward observers, calling fire missions using codes and map coordinates. They learned to read Japanese documents and maps, recognizing military symbols and unit designations. They studied Japanese tactics, learning how the enemy positioned machine guns, camouflaged bunkers, and placed observation posts. But beyond tactical skills, something else developed among these 40 outcasts. They began to trust each other, to function as a unit despite their diverse backgrounds. They developed fierce pride, a sense of being apart from the regular Marine Corps, special and deadly. They called themselves the 40 Thieves, embracing the criminal reputation that had brought many of them to Risley's attention. They became what Risley had envisioned: resourceful, aggressive, highly skilled warriors who would accomplish their mission regardless of orders, regulations, or cost. In June 1944, they boarded the USS Cambria with the 2nd Marine Division, destination Saipan, a 15-mile-long island in the Marianas Chain, strategically vital because B-29 bombers based there could reach the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimated 30,000 Japanese defenders, but the scouts' new intelligence estimates were often dangerously wrong. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato had fortified the island extensively, positioning artillery in caves immune to naval bombardment, constructing bunkers that covered every approach. The Japanese had sworn to defend Saipan to the last man, and the scouts knew this was no empty propaganda. The night before the landing, Tachsky gathered his platoon on the darkened deck. He reminded them of their training, their responsibilities to each other, and the mission that justified their existence. They would land in the 3rd wave, then push inland far beyond the front lines, identifying enemy positions and reporting what they found. They would be the eyes of the division, and thousands of Marines would live or die based on their reconnaissance accuracy. Some of them would not survive. Every scout met his gaze and nodded. They understood. The bombardment of Saipan began at dawn on June 15, 1944. 8 battleships, 11 cruisers, and countless destroyers poured shells onto the island. The thunder was continuous, pressing against their chests. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. The Navy had promised the most intensive pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history, but the scouts had heard similar promises at Tarawa. They checked their weapons with grim knowledge that the Japanese would be waiting in fortifications naval guns could not reach. At 800 hours, the first wave churned toward the beaches, and Japanese artillery opened fire. Geysers of water erupted among the landing craft. Machine gun fire from the cliffs created visible lines of splashes across the water. At 8:43 hours, the scouts loaded into their Amtrak. Lieutenant Tachsky stood at the front, already analyzing terrain and identifying potential enemy positions. The Amtrak lurched forward, joining dozens of others in a race toward the beach. Artillery shells screamed overhead. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar punctuated by explosions and machine gun fire. The Amtrak hit the beach and the ramp dropped. Tachsky was first off, sprinting up the black volcanic sand toward the tree line, his platoon following in practiced dispersal. The beach was chaos. Wounded Marines lay among destroyed Amtraks, medics working frantically while machine gun fire kicked up sand. Artillery shells exploded without warning, but the scouts did not stop. Their mission lay inland, and Tachsky led them toward the vegetation at a dead run. They pushed 300 yards inland in the first hour, farther than any other unit. Regular Marine companies were still consolidating on the beach, but the scouts operated under different rules. They moved in teams of 4, leapfrogging through the jungle with precision born of endless drilling. The vegetation was dense, tropical forest broken by ravines and coral outcroppings. The Japanese had prepared this ground carefully, clearing fields of fire while leaving approach routes that seemed open, but were actually targeted killing zones. The first Japanese position they encountered was a machine gun nest firing from a coral bunker. 2 Japanese soldiers crouched behind a Type 92 heavy machine gun, methodically firing into the landing area 300 yards away. Corporal James "Snake" Davidson, a former juvenile delinquent from Tennessee, crept to within 15 feet of the position. When he struck, it was with the knife they had trained with for months, the blade entering the gunner's neck at the precise angle that severed the carotid without allowing sound. Private First Class, Martinez killed the loader with a garrote in 3 seconds. The machine gun went silent, and 2 Japanese soldiers were dead before they knew the enemy was present. They found and marked 17 Japanese positions in the first 2 hours ashore, using colored smoke grenades and radio calls to direct naval gunfire onto bunkers and artillery pieces, devastating the Marines on the beach. They watched as 14-inch shells from the battleship California obliterated a Japanese 75 artillery position. They saw an observation post disappear in a direct hit after they radioed precise coordinates. Marines were surviving because of the targets they identified. But the deeper they penetrated, the more dangerous their situation became. They were now nearly a mile ahead of the front lines, operating in territory where every sound could bring an enemy patrol. They moved with extreme caution, freezing when they heard Japanese voices. Once, an entire Japanese platoon marched past the ravine where half the scout platoon lay hidden, so close the scouts could smell rice and fish on the enemy's breath. The scouts remained motionless, barely breathing, fingers on triggers but knowing that firing would bring hundreds more. The Japanese passed, unaware that 40 American Marines had been close enough to touch them. At approximately 1400 hours, Sergeant Bill Nappel was observing a valley northeast of the beachhead when movement caught his eye. Through binoculars, he watched as camouflage netting was pulled back from cave entrances and Japanese Type 97 medium tanks began rolling into assembly positions. He counted carefully, 3 times to be certain. 37 tanks, the entire Japanese armored reserve on Saipan, preparing for a counterattack that would hit the Marine beachhead at dusk. If those tanks reached the beach while the Marines were still disorganized, they could potentially drive the Americans into the sea. Nappel encoded the radio message, though he knew calling in this report would bring every Japanese patrol down on his position. The radio operator sent the message 3 times to ensure receipt. At division headquarters, the report caused immediate consternation. Aerial reconnaissance had not detected any Japanese armor in that sector. Intelligence had mentioned at most a company of light tanks. 37 medium tanks represented a force that could destroy the beachhead. Within minutes, Tachsky received urgent orders. Maintain observation, report any movement immediately, and if possible, guide fire missions onto the assembly area. Tachsky split his platoon, sending half back to establish communication relays, while he took 20 men deeper into enemy territory to maintain observation on the tank battalion. The observation post they established overlooked the Japanese tank assembly area from 800 meters distant, perfect range for calling artillery but terrifyingly exposed. Tachsky positioned snipers to cover approaches, placed a bazooka team where they could engage any enemy patrol, and settled in to watch. Through the afternoon, they observed Japanese commanders organizing their forces, tanks being refueled, infantry battalions assembling. The scouts radioed continuous updates, building a complete picture that allowed Marine commanders to reposition forces. At 1730 hours, the Japanese tanks began to move. 37 armored vehicles rolling down the valley in a formation that would bring them to Marine lines just after dusk. It was sound tactics, and if it succeeded, June 15, 1944 would be remembered as the day the Saipan invasion failed. But the Japanese had not accounted for 20 Marine scouts watching from a position they did not know existed. Tachsky made the hardest decision of his life. He could call artillery onto the Japanese tanks, destroying the formation before it reached the beachhead. But doing so would reveal his position beyond any doubt, and the Japanese would send every available unit to eliminate the observation post. His 20 Marines would face hundreds or thousands of enemy soldiers with no possibility of reinforcement or retreat. The alternative was to let the tanks proceed and hope Marines on the beach could stop the armored assault without warning. He thought of the Marines struggling ashore that morning, exhausted and disorganized. He thought of the division command post, vulnerable on the beach. He thought of the 40 criminals who had trusted him. Then he picked up the radio handset and began calling fire missions. The artillery fire was devastating. Shells landed directly among the tank formation, destroying vehicles, killing crews, throwing the attack into chaos. Naval gunfire added to the carnage. Within 15 minutes, the Japanese tank battalion ceased to exist as a coherent force. Burning vehicles blocked the valley. Survivors abandoned their tanks and fled. The threat to the Marine beachhead was eliminated. The scouts had accomplished their mission, but now they had to survive the consequences. The Japanese reaction was immediate and furious. Artillery fire began falling on the ridge where the scouts had established their observation post, forcing them to abandon the position and withdraw. Japanese infantry turned toward the ridge, determined to eliminate the American unit that had destroyed their armored force. The scouts could hear whistles and shouted commands as enemy units organized the search. Tachsky led his reduced platoon south, moving parallel to the Japanese lines, but away from the greatest concentration of enemy forces. They traveled in complete silence, hand signals only, weapons ready, but orders absolute that no one would fire unless discovered with no alternative. Their only chance was to evade, to slip through Japanese lines like ghosts and rejoin American forces before they were surrounded and annihilated. The withdrawal was a nightmare. They moved through ravines and across ridgelines, always with sounds of Japanese searchers close by. Twice they hid in thick vegetation while enemy patrols passed within arm's reach, the scouts lying motionless with pounding hearts, knowing any movement would end in a desperate battle they could not win. They crossed streams, using water to mask their scent. They climbed cliffs that seemed impossible. As darkness fell, danger increased. The jungle at night was absolute blackness, making movement nearly impossible without noise. But remaining stationary meant Japanese patrols would eventually find them. Tachsky decided to continue moving, using every technique they had learned. Private First Class Thomas Red Morrison from Alabama, raised hunting in swamps and forests, led them through the night. He moved by feel, by the texture of vegetation, by subtle changes in air temperature. The other scouts followed in a file, each man maintaining contact with the Marine in front. They encountered a Japanese patrol at approximately 2200 hours, hearing voices and equipment approaching. The scouts froze, sinking into whatever cover was available. The Japanese were searching methodically, probing vegetation with bayonets. The patrol passed within 5 meters of Sergeant Nappel's position, so close he could have reached out and touched the nearest soldier. The scouts did not breathe, did not move, becoming part of the jungle through sheer will. After minutes that felt like hours, the Japanese patrol moved on. They reached American lines at approximately 300 hours, approaching from an unexpected direction, and nearly being shot by nervous sentries before Tachsky could identify his unit. The Marines manning the perimeter could not believe the scouts had operated so far forward and survived. They had been written off as casualties. But Tachsky had brought his 20 men back, everyone alive, after accomplishing a reconnaissance mission that had saved the beachhead. But the 40 Thieves mission on Saipan was far from over. Over the following days and weeks, they conducted continuous patrols deep into Japanese territory, identifying artillery positions, observing enemy movements, calling fire missions that destroyed bunkers and supply dumps. They lived in the jungle for days at a time, eating cold rations, drinking from streams, sleeping in 4-hour shifts. They developed a reputation among regular Marine infantry as ghosts who could move through enemy territory at will. Japanese soldiers told prisoners they feared the American scouts more than any other enemy, calling them night devils who killed without sound and disappeared without trace. But the cost was staggering. The 40 thieves who had landed on Saipan were reduced steadily by casualties. Private First Class Jenkins from Chicago was killed by a sniper while observing a Japanese supply dump. Corporal Rodriguez from New Mexico lost his leg to a mine, bleeding out before a medic could reach him. Sergeant Miller from Wyoming was captured during a night patrol, and his body was found days later bearing signs of torture. The physical conditions were as dangerous as enemy action. Malaria infected more than half the platoon. Dysentery plagued them all, dehydrating and weakening them until simple movements became acts of will. Tropical ulcers developed on their legs and feet. They lost weight dramatically, their uniforms hanging loose, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed with exhaustion. But they continued their missions, driven by loyalty to each other and the knowledge that Marines depended on their intelligence to survive. One critical mission came during the third week when Japanese forces were compressed into northern Saipan. Intelligence reported the Japanese were preparing a final Banzai attack, but did not know when or where. Tachsky took 8 scouts on a deep reconnaissance patrol, penetrating nearly 2 miles beyond the front lines to observe enemy preparations. What they discovered was horrifying. Thousands of Japanese soldiers assembling in a narrow valley, wounded men who could barely walk being given rifles and grenades, officers preparing units for an attack everyone knew was suicide. The scouts observed civilians being forced to join the attack, women and children given bamboo spears, and told to charge American positions. It was madness born of desperation, but it would cost thousands of American lives if the Marines were not prepared. The scouts maintained their observation post for 36 hours, watching preparations, counting units, identifying likely attack routes. They radioed continuous reports that allowed Marine commanders to reposition forces and bring additional artillery into position. When the assault came on the night of July 6, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged the Marine lines in a human wave that should have overwhelmed the defenders. But the Marines were ready, forewarned by the scouts, positioned perfectly to meet the attack with artillery, machine guns, and rifles that created a killing zone the Japanese could not penetrate. The Banzai attack failed with catastrophic Japanese casualties, and the battle for Saipan effectively ended. But it had cost the 40 Thieves 3 more scouts killed and 2 wounded. When Saipan was declared secure on July 9, 1944, only 17 of the original 40 scouts who had landed on the beach walked off the island. 23 had been killed, wounded severely enough to require evacuation, or were missing in action. The casualty rate exceeded 56%, losses that would have destroyed any normal unit. But the survivors carried with them the knowledge that they had accomplished something extraordinary. The intelligence they gathered was unprecedented in detail and accuracy. They had mapped more than 200 Japanese defensive positions. They had called artillery and naval gunfire missions that destroyed enemy artillery, ammunition dumps, and command posts, directly saving countless Marine lives. They had discovered the Japanese tank battalion that would have devastated the beachhead and guided fire missions that eliminated the threat. They had conducted reconnaissance operations deeper into enemy territory than any unit before them, establishing techniques that would become standard doctrine for special operations forces. The legacy of the 40 Thieves extended far beyond Saipan. The tactics they developed became the foundation for modern special operations. Marine Corps reconnaissance battalions that would serve in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict traced their lineage directly to Tachsky's experimental platoon. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and other special operations units studied the 40 Thieves' operations and incorporated their lessons into training and doctrine. Most significantly, the 40 Thieves proved that unconventional soldiers, men who did not fit the standard military mold, could accomplish missions conventional units could not. The criminals, troublemakers, and misfits Risley had pulled from brigs had become elite warriors, proving that initiative, creativity, and determination could sometimes matter more than discipline and conformity. The survivors returned to different fates. Some remained in the Marine Corps, their records expunged, their criminal pasts forgiven. Tachsky remained in the military, eventually retiring as a colonel, spending his later years giving lectures on small unit tactics. Others returned to civilian life, carrying physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal, memories of friends left behind on a Pacific island most Americans could not locate on a map. Many never spoke of their service with the 40 Thieves, keeping silent about missions that remained classified for decades. They returned to families who could not understand what they had done, employers who saw only their criminal records, a society that celebrated victory without understanding the intimate brutality of how that victory had been achieved. They lived with survivor's guilt, with knowledge that they had killed men in ways they could never describe, with memories of decisions made in seconds that had determined who lived and who died. The official records remained classified for more than 50 years. The American public learned of the scout sniper's heroism only gradually, through books and documentaries that appeared decades after the war, by which time many survivors had passed away without recognition. But within the military, the legend of the 40 Thieves was passed down through generations, a story told to young Marines and special operations soldiers about what could be accomplished by a small unit of determined warriors led by an innovative officer. The battle for Saipan cost the 2nd Marine Division over 5,000 casualties, with more than 1,200 Marines killed. The Japanese defenders fought nearly to annihilation, with over 29,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead by the time the island was secured. The strategic value was immense, providing bases from which American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands, but the human cost was staggering. The story of the 40 Thieves reminds us that war is not won solely by grand strategies and massive forces, but also by small groups of determined individuals who accomplish seemingly impossible missions. It reminds us that heroism exists in many forms, that men society had rejected as criminals could become warriors of extraordinary skill and courage when given purpose and leadership. Most importantly, it reminds us of the human cost of war, the young men who volunteered or were conscripted into service, trained for missions that would likely kill them, and went forward anyway because their comrades and their country needed them. As we remember the 40 Thieves and their sacrifices on Saipan, we should honor their memory not with empty platitudes but with honest reflection on what they endured and what they accomplished. If you found this story compelling, if the courage and sacrifice of the 40 Thieves moved you, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Ask yourself, what would you have done in their place? Could you have survived the Saipan jungle under fire like they did? These men were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who rose to extraordinary challenges. Their story deserves to be remembered, honored, and never forgotten.